Good morning, dear friends. Today is Friday, August 20th, the 12th of Elul. Today we're learning, like every day, the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Presently, Meseches Shabbos, chapter 7, Parak Gadol, Ayin Beis, Amud Beis. That's 72B. We do have a small segment we need to go back to when we finish this. So, but that's where we're holding. Today we're dedicating learning for the yard site of Barbara, Mrs. Beanstalk's father, Yitzchak ben Moshe Olav Hashalom, whose yard site is today. And the Beanstalks are important members of our Talmud community, and we honor the yard site with our learning today. And we're grateful to Mark and Barbara for their contributions and frequent participation and devotion to our Gemara study group, along with all of our other dear members of the Chabura. And also, I want to mention this week's learning is dedicated for Chayalea, Mas Arya Leib Aleha Hashalom, who's again another member of the Chabura, who's his grandmother's yard site. So that is with the dedication. We've pivoted just ever so slightly, or we've moved past the discussion of how one might escape bringing multiple chatoses depending on his awareness and insight, but we're not entirely past it. We're moving on to a topic which brings up the word of kavana, and it actually introduces us to a third way that a person could find themselves inadvertently desecrating Shabbos, which is not even classified as a chatos. It's not even classified as a sin offering. I'm sorry, a person wouldn't have to bring a sin offering because it's not even a shoygeg. The way our Gemara terms this is, the word we use is, let me give you the exact phrase.
Mitasek.
Mitasek, but there's another phrase before it, which I was looking for, but yeah, misasek. In other words, the person is doing something with his hands, but there's a total severing between mind and action. And so this is not even, depending on the exact circumstances, potentially not even considered a shoygeg, where there was a lapse of awareness, a mistake, an accident here. It's even more than that. Now, here's what's interesting. I believe in the spoken English, we don't always distinguish between different madrego, different types of accidents. I'm just going to hit mute all, but you'll unmute, please, for comments. And the word accident or mistake, I believe, well, the word mistake, I believe, can cover a broad spectrum of actions that were not entirely intended. But actually the word, and so there are mistakes that are negligent. You should have taken steps to prevent it. There are mistakes which were on good, with faulty information. And then there are mistakes that were entirely a lapse and entirely beyond your intention in any sense, whatever. So here we're talking about misasek, where what you were doing is what you were doing, but your intention was entirely different. And for the purposes of bringing a carbon chatos, that is not considered even a shoygeg. Of course, how far this principle is applied is subject to a machlokes, Abaya and Rava. And we also have an interesting debate between Rashi and Tosfos in the exact specifics of our case. And so let's share the screen and we'll begin studying, and we'll see the distinction. Well, briefly, we'll see the distinction between how Tosfos and Rashi learn that Gemara. And I'll point out to you that Rabbi Steinsaltz, the Steinsaltz Gemara in this instance, is going to choose to explain the Gemara according to the way Tosfos explains it, although we will primarily focus on Rashi's perspective. So we'll share the screen in a moment and get started.
Can we view the mitasek as an unintended or unforeseeable side effect, as different, say, from a foreseeable side effect, like when you drag a chair and you make a bureau that could be foreseen. But here is something that one wasn't able to foresee that the side effect will take place.
Yes. Thank you, Professor. There is a distinction between miskaven, where your intention is not for the result of your action, but you know your action is going to also do something. For example, dragging a bench, which the Gemara has its own treatment of such cases. In other words, your desired result is A, but along the way towards your desired result, there is another necessary effect that's going to happen, as opposed to in our instance, where there is almost a mind, there's a detachment between what your brain is telling your hands to do and what your hands are doing. Whereas the typical shogeg has to do with a lack of awareness. It's not that you didn't realize that you were going to do what you were going to do. It's that you were under the impression, typically, shogeg is you were under the impression this act is acceptable. And that's why throughout the discussion of the textbook shogeg, our discussion was, oh, the person didn't know it was Shabbos, so therefore he didn't observe the laws. It was something that he didn't know about. He knew he was driving or whatever he was doing. He just didn't know that it was Shabbos, or he did not know that these actions are considered melachos on Shabbos, but he knew what he was doing. And in our case, where his brain knows that you're not supposed to, for example, pull something out of the ground, and his brain is not telling him to pull something out of the ground, but somewhere between mind and hand, there was some kind of detachment, or you'll give me a better way to describe that, but there's something broken in the link between what your mind is saying you're going to do and what your hands are doing. And so there's no kavanah, or your kavanah is something else. So let's see the Gemara. We'll start again.
Rabbi.
Yes.
I think the professor is asking a different kind of question. I think, if I understand the professor, he's asking a question. If you go to pick something, you're not going to intend to pick something up. So if there's a lot of things around there, you should know that there's a danger. I think that's what the professor is asking, which is a little different.
Respectfully, I disagree in the interpretation of the professor's comment.
So let's go to the source. Let's go to the source.
So the source wanted to say that the term mitasek is a new one, at least for me.
Yes.
And from the description of what the Talmud gives us about the event that triggers this situation, it seems to me that they distinguish between a side effect that is foreseeable and the side effect that one couldn't able to foresee starting an action. That is, in all the cases, the source of the situation is an action. And in this case, one intended to perform one action, and regardless of whether he performed that action or not, another action took place that the possibility of this action was hidden from him when he started the intended action. That is, I think that this is why they treat it more leniently, because the person wasn't able to foresee the situation that will take place, the violation of Shabbos, unlike dragging the chair, where one in sound mind was able to foresee that the borrow would be created.
And following, Professor, thank you. Following your clarification, Roberto now has a question. So now that we've distinguished between a foreseeable circumstance and an unforeseeable circumstance, the professor says we should consider how much of a burden we're going to place on the individual to predict that the unforeseeable may actually transpire. Roberto, did I understand?
Absolutely.
So Roberto, your question will remain in our minds, but won't be resolved in this moment. But indeed, it is a good question, which is, when can we tell the person, you make that mistake once, I understand. You make the mistake twice, but if every single Shabbos you keep on conveniently making that mistake, at what point does that turn into a foreseeable scenario? And that is indeed a good question. And Professor, I want to thank you for bringing good edifying and clarifying comments to help us understand what is unique or what is new about our scenario. So let's just start from the top again. Itmar, we're going to quote now a machlokes Abaye and Rava, following which we are going to hear, the Gemara is going to hash out and workshop the distinctions between the two. Not unlike the Gemara yesterday, that workshop, it's not going to be so much pasuk based, it'll be a little pasuk based, but somewhat along the lines, although I think something we'll enjoy even more, like yesterday's Gemara. Niskaven like b'yas hatalosh, a person is intending to pick up something that is not attached to the ground. And inadvertently, unintentionally, what he did was he uprooted something that is attached to the ground. So his mind is telling him, pick up something that is entirely acceptable. He reached down and his hand executed something other than what his mind told him to do. And so this is not a shogeg where he was lacking data. His hand did something he very much did not intend at all to do. He didn't foresee it occurring, and therefore, pater, he is exempt. And this statement, prior to additional clarification, is quite clear. Everybody agrees, pater. Now, the reason why the thing that we need to bear in mind is that these words are slightly obscure, and so Rashi and Tosfos will have nuanced differences in how they translate the words. Let me just interrupt. Shalom, this is the hemispheres. Yes. Dr. Arad, pardon me, folks. I want to thank you for your service. No, but now I want to add an instruction. It's very important that Lazar, who's on the list, gets the package because her children sponsored the package in honor of her husband's yard site. So if you'll just give extra care at the front desk that they maybe thank you.
The hemisphere normally lets me go in.
It depends by the building. You may have an easy job.
All right. There are 4 hemispheres. So which one? So do you know?
All right, I'm sorry. That's the simple case. What if his intention was to do an action of cutting? But what is he going to be cutting? That which is permissible to cut because it is not attached to the ground. But when he went and cut, he ends up cutting something that is attached to it, which is an action that is entirely not acceptable on Shabbos. So his intention is A, his action is B, but what he intends to do and what he does is closer. It's the same motion, the same action. The subject of his cutting is what is different. Rava Amar Pater. Rava says, still Pater. There is still a big difference between what he had in mind and what his hands did. And this is not considered a desecration of Shabbos. He didn't intend to do it. He didn't even intend to do it, not realizing that it was prohibited. This was totally not what he meant to do. That's what Rava says. Again, we'll read Rashi. We'll have some additional commentary in a moment. Abaye Amar, Abaye says, no, chayiv, you are chayiv. This is a different kind of case than niskaven la'agbiya v'chotos, where what you thought was you're going to lift up and you end up chopping. 2 different actions. Rav Amar Pater, Rava says, you know why? The individual who intends to cut something that is detached and permissible to chop, but then he ends up chopping something that's attached to the ground. Why is he pater? The haloi mechavein lechaticha de isura. His kavana, his intention, what his mind understands and is telling his hand to do is to do something that is acceptable. His mind is not intending to do anything that is prohibited. Abaye Amar, Abaye says, no, chayiv. You are still liable. Why? His intention is to do chopping. He needs to clarify. He needs to be absolutely certain that what he chops is acceptable on Shabbos. He intended to do the act that he did. And so we're not going to allow him to remove his intention from what he did. Because ultimately his mind told him, take that knife and chop. And he took that knife and chopped. And so there is too much connection. There's too much association between what his mind told him to do and what his hand does, according to Abaye. And therefore, we're not going to consider this an act of mindless misasik that's removed. Your hands are doing something that are removed from your brain's instruction. The Gemara is going to elaborate. Rebel, yes?
Rabbi, I know we're talking in the times of the Beis Hamikdash, but I'm just wondering, in the modern world, if somebody wasn't sure of something they did on Shabbos, and they would come to a Rav to ask him, would he go into this whole area, or would he say these things are strictly for karbonas?
In other words, your question is, a person is in Chodesh Elul and they want to really do teshuvah. And they ask the rabbi, do I need to do teshuvah for a misasik scenario? Or would the rabbi not even start probing that far? Is that what your question is?
Yes.
Interesting question. I believe, by the way, the translation here of the word pater is not go ahead and do it. It's that this doesn't hit the threshold of a carbon. So I believe, I want to be careful about what I say, that there is a degree of teshuvah associated even with such an act. But it doesn't trigger the biblical obligations of karbonos. And we'll see a little bit more about the why in a moment. But it's a good question. In other words, you're asking today, do we need to be at all mindful of such situations? I believe the answer is yes, but I think there's a distinction between being aware of things that we've done that we regret and beating ourselves up to a point of unhealthy, and I'll let the mental health professionals weigh in more, but I think this too would be part of a teshuvah process. And I think if we'll examine carefully the text of the Vidoy, we'll find that there are comments that are inclusive of such scenarios as well, right? Let's see Rashi. Niskaven lagbias atalish. I know we did this yesterday, but it's essential that we review it and gain further clarity. Niskaven lagbias atalish. The word lahagbia, es hatalish, in the context of removing something from the ground, sounds like he's going to be picking up a detached vegetation from the ground. That's the simple Hebrew reading. If we were just learning, if we were in an Ulpan and we were learning Mishnaic Hebrew, I'm not sure if Ulpans teach Mishnaic Hebrew, but if we were going to be learning Mishnaic Hebrew and we were going to read this and we'd say Neskaven lagbiya satalish, and you're going to pick up that which is detached, especially if you're going to see the context of a chatach esam mechuber, but he ended up chopping something that is attached. We would decipher this to mean vegetation. Rashi, for halachic considerations and for further context considerations, gives us a slightly less anticipated interpretation. Kigoin de nafal sakin be'arugas hayarak. We're talking about a knife that fell into the vegetables, into your garden. And what he is intending to pick up is a knife. He's not even picking up something that's a vegetable. He's reaching down. And by the way, think about it. If you're sometimes you just reach down and grab something and you don't even look. You know it's there, and you feel for it and you grab it. I'm sure it's happened, or maybe it's more likely to happen if you're in bed and something falls off the side of the bed and you reach down and you just grab something. But Rashi, again, for halachic considerations, for deeper considerations, wants to provide this interpretation as opposed to a more literal reading, which is that you pick up something that is detached. It has to do with the distance between your intention and your action. Rashi, in his interpretation, is providing greater distance. It's not just that you're picking up a detached item, you're picking up an attached item, but you're totally doing a different motion. You are picking something up as opposed to cutting something. You are removed from the entire gathering of vegetation. Rebel, yes.
Sorry, Rabbi, but that's exactly the point. If you're looking at picking up some grass, okay, that's one thing. But if you see a knife, surely a knife should lead you to say it might cut something on the way up. It's exactly the kind of area that I was confused about.
Very good, very good. But ultimately, what we're talking about is a single hand motion of picking something. Oh, I hear what you're saying. So the question is, what is he cutting? Are we talking that he cut something with his knife? Or that he ends up pulling a branch, which feels very similar to his knife. He picks it up, and before he notices it, he's holding a carrot in his hand or something. I don't know. It's like he plucks something out. I believe that's what we're talking about, according to a way of interpreting Rashi. But you're adding a good question. What's the exact translation of the chatach? Does the chatach mean he used a knife? Or does it mean that he plucked it? And again, literal interpretation would make us think that he ends up cutting it with a knife, except for, how would that work? You're reaching for something and you pull it out, and somehow your knife chopped it. So I don't want to confuse things too much. We could. The commentaries and the Achronim in particular go very deeply in taking this apart. But let's try to read the Rashi simply just for a moment. He intends to pick up a knife and he ends up pulling up vegetation. I know you could decipher that differently, but that's how we decipher. And Rashi again wants to have the person's the subject to be two separate items, knife or vegetation, as opposed to the more instinctive reading, which is we're talking about two types of vegetation, but they're the same, right? Detached and attached. Why do I point this out to you? I just want to show you Tosfos briefly. Tosfos says, Pirush ba'kontris, he quotes Rashi. And Tosfos has problems based on later on the next step of the Gemara. But let's just skip down to the end. The Nirala Rabbeinu Tam's understanding of this Gemara is the Hachamairi here we're talking about. He intends to remove something that's detached, but it turns out that it's something that is detached and he's cutting it. He cut what he intended. No, I'm sorry, just scratch that. So Tosfos wants to decipher this in a more literal reading. He intended to pick up vegetation that was detached, and he ends up picking up something that is attached. Tosfos has deep halachic considerations as well, but I primarily want to show you that his interpretation is more consistent with the literal reading, the ulpan reading of this text, which again, now I'll show you. Steinsaltz translates it as well. One who intended to lift a plant and mistakenly severed a plant. He doesn't talk about a knife. So in this case, where Steinsaltz is rejecting Rashi's interpretation for the ulpan-like reading. All right, so here we have it. Abai and Rav, everyone agrees that if his intention is to remove something that is detached, to pick it up and he ends up cutting, picking up and cutting are two separate actions. According to Rashi, he wants it not only to be picking up versus cutting, but you're picking up one item and you end up cutting another item, further removing what his mind is telling him and what his hand is doing.
What was he doing with the knife in the first place?
Good question. He was walking through the garden to his Shabbos table and he was carrying the challah knife. And
Challah knife.
I don't know. What's he doing with the knife on Shabbos? He's walking through the garden.
With a challah knife.
Probably, okay. Listen, if we want to be creative, we could imagine it. We could game out a whole scenario. But maybe they're having a garden side meal. And he drops the knife and he reaches down off his chair and he ends up. Anyways, we could come up with hypotheticals.
You're so protective of people.
Huh?
You're so protective of people.
What do you mean?
You're such a kind person.
All right, let's see Rashi. Thank you. V'chatach es hamechuber pater. Rashi. D'chsiv asher chata ba. The verse that describes the atonement for sin says that he sinned in it. What does it mean, asher chata ba? So interesting, Professor. This is going to be, and for everyone, until now, our conversation has been entirely rational. There's different kinds of mistakes. There are mistakes that are closer. There's a deeper or closer association between what his mind is instructing his hand to do. Then there's a scenario of misasek, where his hands are mindlessly or with being detached from the mind doing an action. It's all been in higayon. It's all been in rationale. But in truth, and we're going to see later on in the Gemara, it's connected to psukim and the way the Chazal interpret psukim. Because ultimately, why is there really a difference between if he thought it was acceptable, but it wasn't, or if he didn't realize what he was doing. They're both things that the guy entirely understood to be acceptable. And they were mistakenly, and that was a mistake because it was unacceptable. So Rashi explains it ultimately comes down to Psukim. The Gemara explains. Asher Chatava, the Gemara in Krisos explains, the verse says that you have to atone for a sin, Asher Chatava, that you sinned in it. The Gemara in Krisos says, Prat l'misasik v'davar acher. This excludes a scenario where the sin was not ba. The sin was not where his mind was at. The sin, mistake, was not where he was acting. V'asa davar zeh. And he did it. So what would be a shoygeg? His intention was to do the action. But he was mistaken. This savar sheina yom Shabbos. Ay savar shemalacha zumuteres. Here, he intends to lift up, not to chop. So this is an important Rashi because he both introduces the pasuk's influence to this distinction, but he also gives us a clear distinction between the two scenarios. A Rava says, you know why in our case, where you meant to cut something that's detached and you cut something that's attached, you know why, according to Rava, you're exempt? Because there are two kinds of choppings and they're totally different. There's a kind of chaticha that's permitted, and there's a kind of chaticha that's prohibited, and they're two different worlds. And what his mind is saying is chop, a permissible chop, do the Jewish chop. You can cut, you're allowed to cut, right? You're allowed to chop up a salad. There's no problem with that. See Rashi, v'shigas Shabbos, v'shigas malacha. Elamis asik v'chatichas heter have. Sheyadei Shabbos. He's doing something in his mind that he knows is acceptable. And he knows that you're not allowed to cut something that's not attached. And so his mind is he's clearly not doing something wrong. His hands are doing something wrong. So according to Rava, there's no connection between what his mind is telling him to do, cut something that is permissible, to then cutting something that is not acceptable. It comes Abaye and says no. Ultimately, what his mind is telling his hands are chop, and what he did is chop. And so we cannot say that it's not asher chatava. We can't say that the sin was not in the area where his mind is instructing him to go, because ultimately, yeah, it's true, he intended to cut something else, but that would be like a shoygeg. He doesn't intend to cut it, but ultimately, there's consistency. There's too much of an association with what his mind is instructing and his hands are implementing. That is, again, this teaching in a nutshell. Amar Rava. So now Rava says, and Rava's proof or support of his reasoning is going to introduce questions that are going to also need to be resolved. Amar Rava, how do I know what I just told you? In other words, how do I know that if his intention was A and he executed B, even if they were like the same action? Well, how do I know that it's patur? Tanya, there's a brisa that says like this: Chomer Shabbos mishar mitzvos, v'chomer shar mitzvos mishabbos. There is an area where Shabbos is much more stringent than other mitzvahs. The Chomer shar mitzvos mishabbos, and there are scenarios, there are ways that other mitzvahs are more strict, more stringent than Shabbos. The interesting thing is that ultimately the Gemara is going to say that shar mitzvahs actually doesn't mean all mitzvahs. It means a specific mitzvah. And namely, I believe we're going to come down to avodah zarah, a distinction in how a person would bring a chatos for committing the sin of avodah zarah inadvertently. Yes, I know there's a question, how do you do avodah zarah intentionally? The Gemara will get to all of it. So again, Bryce, there's something about Shabbos that makes it more strict than other mitzvahs in the realm of bringing a carbon. And there's a stringency of other mitzvahs over Shabbos. How does it work? Chomer Shabbos mishar mitzvahs. How is Shabbos more strict than other mitzvahs? Shabbos asa shtayim behelam echad. On Shabbos, it's plausible that a person could do two acts of Shabbos desecration in a single lapse of awareness, and yet chayiv al kalachas va'achas, he'll still be chayiv for each act. What would that be? When he did two different malachos, two different prohibited acts on Shabbos, they both really are under the same mitzvah of observe Shabbos, don't desecrate Shabbos, and yet he's going to have to atone for each category of malacha, each category of work separate, even though it was the same lapse of mind about Shabbos. Masha'en came b'shar mitzvahs. Other mitzvahs, if you commit the same mitzvah twice, or I should say, if you break, you do the same avera twice, in the same lapse of awareness, even if the actions are different, and the Gemara is going to explain what it is, you'll only be chayiv a single chatas. Chomer shar mitzvahs, and there is a stringency of other mitzvahs over Shabbos. Shebashar mitzvahs shagag v'loy miskaven chayiv. In other mitzvahs, if you did it as a shoygeg and v'loy miskaven, you had no intention of doing the act, chayiv, it would still be classified as a shoygeg, and you'd be liable for a carbon. Masha'en came to Shabbos, as opposed to Shabbos, where in the laws of Shabbos there's this added facet of misasek, meaning there's zero kavana, and you're off the hook. So, what's the punchline before we move on? This idea of kavana, and Professor, yes, we have two different kinds of miskaven. You have that your intention was not to have the result, but you knew the result was going to happen. But what we're talking about now is that your kavana was entirely removed from what your hands have done, and therefore you don't have to bring a chatas according to Shabbos. But in other sins, other mitzvahs, I should say, that doesn't work that way, and you would have to bring a chatas.
Rabbi, what are other mitzvahs? I'm sort of lost because it seems to me that we are talking about the same thing. A stricture with regard to Shabbos, and we here mean performing two prohibited acts in one act of awareness, which is greater than the stricture with regard to other mitzvot. What are other mitzvot with regard to Shabbos that have less stricture? I'm not sure.
Your question is the Gemara's next question. The Gemara is going to say, let's figure this out. Are there other mitzvahs that you might desecrate in different ways, and you would be chayiv only a single chatas? So the Gemara is going to try to figure this out. So it's a good question. I hope I understood your question. And so maybe after we'll read the Gemara, we may remain with the question, but let us see the Gemara's commentary. All right, the Gemara continues. Well, let's read Rabbi Stein's just apparently the phrase unwittingly, without intent, misasek without kavana, is exclusively our case. Oh, here, okay. Before we go down the side of understanding this text, why does Rava introduce this text, and the idea of doing something misasek b'lei miskaven? Rava understands it to be referring to the case of two chatichas, the chaticha that is permissible and the chaticha that is prohibited. Therefore, this is proof to Rava that on Shabbos, when one does not have kavana, because he was really intending to do something else, he would not be chayiv. So Rava understands that this text that talks about the distinction of Shabbos, that you could be exempt for shogag b'lei miskaven, Rava understands it be talking about this case. Now let's see the Gemara's analysis of the text. Amar Mar. Chomer Shabbos mishar mitzvahs. We said that there's a distinction between Shabbos and other mitzvahs. Shabbos also that on Shabbos you can do two acts with a single lapse, and you're chayiv to bring a carbon for each. Masha'en mishar mitzvahs. Hey Chidami, what is the scenario? Where do we have a case of another mitzvah, another avera, that you would do two acts and you would be chayiv only once? Ilema, the avad ksira tchina. What is the comparison? Maybe we're saying that a person did two malachas, kitsira and tchina, right? Those are our prime. Whenever we want to give an example so far of two different Shabbos prohibited acts, we go to kitsira and tchina, cutting, or harvesting, and grinding. The kavasa gavashar mitzvahs. What would be an example by other mitzvahs? Achal chelev adam. And so, for example, when it comes to eating unkosher, a person eats prohibited chelev, those are the fats, and prohibited blood. Hacha tarti mechayiv. Here you're chayiv on the two kinds of food items. And on Shabbos, you're also chayiv. So that can't be the comparison that there is a distinction between Shabbos and Shar mitzvahs. Let's see Rashi. Just like grinding and chopping or harvesting are two totally separate actions, two totally different issues. Well, then we need to have the example of blood and chela, for example. So Elo Shar mitzvahs. Give me an instance of another mitzvah. Professor, I believe this is your question. What would be a scenario where you're chayiv only once? The achal chelev v'chelev, that you ate 2 servings of prohibited chelev in one lapse of awareness. The kavasog Shabbos, what would be the parallel in Shabbos? The avad ktsira, that you chopped off 2 different items from the ground. Well, then the Gemara says that's a problem. Here, they are both alike, that you only bring 1 carbon. So what is the Mishnah, or what is this text, this brisa talking about, that there's a distinction between Shabbos and other mitzvahs? The professor's question, what is that scenario? So the Gemara says, no, here, you know what we're talking about? We're talking about the avad ksira utchina, that on Shabbos, a person did 2 separate actions, 2 separate melachas. How would this be different than other mitzvahs? Where do we find another mitzvah where you do 2 separate actions and you only bring 1 carbon? Avodah zara. This must be talking about a person who commits avodah zara. Person that does avodah zara unintentionally brings a carbon chatas. I don't know if you recall this, but many, many days ago, when we were going through the basics of chatas, we talked about how the chatas offering is bought for a thing that if you did it intentionally, there was either kares or something of that great severity, and we compared it to avodah zara. So we're talking about Shabbos versus avodah zara. Uchid de Rabbi Ami, with the teaching of Rabbi Ami. Rabbi Ami, what did Rabbi Ami teach? Zibach, a person brought an offering. Vikitar, and a person brought ketoires. V'nisech, and a person poured libations. 3 different actions that are done to honor avodah zara. Right, the Jewish people in their service in the Beis Hamikdash, we also bring karbanis and incense and libations of wine. Apparently, other avodah zaras did the same. And if a person did these 3 different actions in honor of avodah zara, b'halama achas, in a single lapse of realizing that these actions are prohibited, in a chayiv al achas, they did 3 different actions, and yet they are only chayiv a single carbon. So the Gemara at this point, we've still forgotten about Rav and Abaya, but we want to understand this essential comparison, and there is a distinction, a chumrah, a stringency of Shabbos over avodah zara, in that when a person does different actions inadvertently, Shabbos you'd bring multiple karbanes, and avodah zara you'd only bring a single carbon for the 3 different modes of avodah zara.
Rabbi, that's very, very hard to swallow.
Why?
Because if we look at the consequences of avodah zara and the consequences of Machalo Shabbos, for one, you're supposed to give up your life.
So we saw a good question. So Rebbe is asking, surely it doesn't make sense that we should be more stringent on the observance of Shabbos than avodah zara if a person has to give up their life for avodah zara and not for Shabbos. That's an interesting question, but in general, although sometimes there are different consequences or different distinctions between different mitzvahs, that does not mean, first of all, that we should, under normal circumstances, consider Shabbos to be a light mitzvah. But more importantly, that's exactly the observation of the brisa. That ironically, although maybe you would think avodah zara is more stringent, well, there are ways that Shabbos is more stringent. And it doesn't have to do with avodah zara being a worse or better avera. It has to do with the mechanics of how Shabbos is observed. Shabbos, although there's although there's the mitzvah of not doing malacha, ultimately each malacha is considered a totally separate prohibition. With avodah zara, they each fall under the same banner of avodah zara. But the irony that you're observing is exactly why I think the part of what the Brisa is finding interesting, if you will. So it's a good point. So now we found our comparison. Shabbos, in a sense, is more strict than Avodah Zarah. Now, the thing that's going to probably bother us, some of us, is how does the Brisa use the phrase shar mitzvahs, all other mitzvahs? And ultimately, the Gemara at this point is compelled to say that the only comparison is not all other mitzvahs, it's a single mitzvah, namely Avodah Zarah. And then there's another question, which is, how does a person come to do Avodah Zarah unintentionally? What does that look like? The Gemara is going to ask that question. But as far as the first question of why are we calling it Kol Shar Mitzvahs, so some of the commentaries say that in truth, the Gemara elsewhere, and maybe even Gemara we've learned, says that Shkula Avodah Zarah connected Kol Mitzvahs. Avodah Zarah is compared to all other mitzvahs. You know why? Because all other mitzvahs become undone if you reject Avodah Zarah. Because the premise of the Torah is that there's one Hashem who's giving us mitzvahs. As soon as you reject that with Avodah Zarah, you're essentially undoing or denying the validity of all the mitzvahs. So whatever the case is, although it's a little bit of a play over here, it's a little bit of a kvetch, but ultimately because Avodah Zarah is compared to all the mitzvahs, therefore it's not entirely unacceptable to call this shar mitzvahs. Alternatively, maybe there are other mitzvahs, but at this point, we're only addressing so far Avodah Zarah. All right, so there's the answer. But the Gemara, of course, is going to take us further along a journey. So the Gemara asks as follows, and this is going to be a little bit of a mind exercise, but we're going to end that. We're going to come out of the other end. We're going to come out all right. Why do you explain the brisa that's contrasting Shabbos to other mitzvahs to be talking about Avodah Zarah? It works in the stringency of Shabbos over Avodah Zarah. But now we need to examine the latter half of the statement. Amos say, read the next part of that brisa. What is the next part of the brisa? Chaymer b'shar mitzvahs, a stringency of other mitzvahs over Shabbos in the department of offerings for atonement. Shebashar mitzvah is shogag v'lo miskaven. Other mitzvahs, if you made a mistake, you did not have kavana, chayiv, you're liable. Masha'en came b'Shabbos as opposed to Shabbos. So now the Gemara says, hold on a second. Now we need to fit this scenario. Shogag v'lo miskaven, no kavana. We got to fit this into Avodah Zarah. How do you have a scenario? Let's look away from the text of the Gemara for a second. Avodah Zarah is not just an action, but it's usually a devotion. It's a service. So how could you find yourself doing the act of Avodah Zarah without kavanah? What does that look like? Where do we have a person's actions and a person's mind apart in the actions of serving Avodah Zarah? How does that look? What does that look like?
A person could be forced.
But that's a whole different animal. That's called an oinus. That's if the person is being compelled. And then there's the question, as Rebel, you brought up, what do you do if a person puts a gun to your head and God forbid says, serve Avodah Zarah, or the cross or the sword, right? What do you do? But that's a different subject. How do you find yourself doing b'lo miskaven? Dr. Hammer, as the expert here on Kavana, you're muted. Please unmute yourself and share with us your thoughts. We can't hear you. You're still muted. Oh.
Okay, so did I lose you?
No, we got you.
You're there.
So you're a tourist, maybe even from Israel, a Chiloni person, and it's December, the end of December, and you're in New York, and you're at Rockefeller Center, and there's this big church, very well known across the street, and everybody's walking in there. So you walk in there, and you look at the architectural beauty, and everybody then gets down on their knees and bows. So you do that. No kavana.
No kavana to do Avodah Zarah. You know that you're bowing down.
You're a tourist, and if you're going to Chinatown and everybody says when you say hello, instead of saying hi, you bow down to the other person, you hold your hands together. No kavana. It's just an act.
Very interesting. Doctor, I think you're onto something. let's see. I think the Gemara has a little bit more of a nuanced conversation, but that's a very important point. And we have other instances. Just to recall that you have the question in the story of Purim, right? You have that there was a decree that they had to bow down to Haman, and Haman would had an avodah zarah in his neck to try to trick people, if you will, or compelling them. So a person is bowing down to Haman out of respect, but really they're bowing down to an avodah zarah. And I was listening to a podcast on Jewish history, and I don't remember which era exactly, but there was basically at a certain point, somewhere between the past 2,000 years or 1,900 years since the advent of Christianity. So there were times that the Jewish people weren't entirely in control of their life circumstances, and there was at a certain point a decree where you have to bow down to the cardinals or priests or whatever the practitioners of Christianity were referred to in that region. And it's documented there was a certain priest or bishop or whatever that was considered a friend of the Jews. And the asterisk, what does it mean he was a friend of the Jews? That before the Jews would bow down to him, he would cover up his cross to give them more comfort in fulfilling this mitzvah. So very interesting. Abriel, you have something to say, and then we're going to look at the Gemara.
Yeah, what Dr. Hammer said, the big danger today is something like Salvation Army, where you think it's just a charity and all of a sudden you're in a revival meeting.
Yep. Important point. All right, so now let's see what the Gemara says. Hi, Shogag, what does this look? Maybe the guy walked into a building, the architecture looked very much like what he remembers it being. He thought it was a shul. And in his tradition, in the shul, you bow down. And he bows down on the carpets and he gets up and he sees there's a big Buddha there. There's a big statue. So he thought he was davening to Hashem. And he was bowing down and there was a statue there somewhere. So doctor, we have to just twist your example just a little bit. He was on a tour of shuls. And along the way, they take him into a church. But the Gemara says, hold on. In that instance, although true, in the picture, he's bowing down to Avodah Zarah. And we have different legends in Jewish history about people that were compelled to bow down, or to go down on the floor to pick something up. But the appearance is Avodah Zarah. So here the Gemara says, Liva Lashamayim. Rashi. Umachiyov yeshkan. Has he committed any sin? Afilu yada shu beis Avodah Zarah v'ishtach v'boy lashamayim ein chiyuv kan. Even if, it's the chiddush, to me at least, even if he was in a temple and he's bowing down, maybe he's being told either bow down or die, and he ultimately has in mind shamayim ein chiyuv kan. This is not considered Avodah Zarah. And recall, we are looking for an example where it was loy miskaven and he's chayiv. Ve'ela, the chazi indrata, he saw an indrata. Rashi, Suras Hamelach, Sh'oisin l'chvayid Hamelach. He saw a statue that was made in certain empires or kingdoms, a picture of the king. Sh'oisin l'chvayid Hamelach, and it's done to show honor to the king. He bowed down to it, but not out of avodah zarah, not out of worship of a divinity, but out of honor. Heichidam. Somewhere says, okay, let's go a little step further. What are we talking about? If he, in his mind, is thinking, I accept this king as God. Now, it sounds crazy to us, but I think we know that throughout history, many times there was a conflation between the ruling monarch or emperor and divinity, right? Going back to Egypt and in more modern times and in Rome, there was always some kind of association, not always, but many times there was some kind of association between the rulers or ruling class and some kind of divinity. If he has in mind that this statue is a god of Avodah Zarah, Mezidu. So then he is not a mistake. There's not a loy miskaven. There's kavana and an action, and so he's outright mezid. But if he does not accept this to be an Avodah Zarah, lav klumhu, then there is no sin involved. There's nothing, not even a shoygeg. He didn't do anything of Avodah Zarah. This is not considered an act of Avodah Zarah. So the Gemara says, Ella, we got to take this a step further. What are we talking about? Me'ava v'yira. Rashi. Me'avas Adam, Yiras Adam, Hishtachava l'avodah zarah. He is enamored by somebody. And that somebody says, if you really love me, you'll bow down to my God. If you're really afraid, if you really respect me, you'll bow down to my God. And by the way, I think, and somehow this is going to be considered a shoygeg v'lo miskaven. Why? Because he knew that this is an avodah zarah. He thought it would be okay because he's not bowing down with intention. But let's read this again. Rashi. Out of a deep emotional reaction or feeling towards another person. He bowed down to avodah zarah. The kari le shoygeg. This is called shoygeg v'lo miskaven. Why? Kiloymar shogag. The mistake is he thought that because what's in his heart is not avodah zarah, but he understands that it's avodah zarah. This is going to be considered a shoygeg. This would work according to Abaya, the Amar Chayiv. Abaya actually says, yeah, this scenario, a person would be Chayiv to bring a carbon. This is a kind of shoygeg that makes him liable. But according to Rava, this is a different argument of Abai and Rava in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, and I think we actually need to look it up. Actually, we don't have time to look it up today. We'll go through this briefly. Bli neder on Sunday, we learn again, we'll look up that Gemara for the full picture. Suffice it to say, Abai and Rav have a similar machlokes in about avodah zarah. So Hanichel Abaya are say that if a person bowed down under the scenarios described, out of love or in fear for another person, you'd be chayiv. Thus, this would be a good distinction between Shabbos and avodah zarah. In Shabbos, there's no miskaven; it's pater. Here, somehow, it's considered the miskaven. El Rava damar pater, but Rava actually over there says such a scenario. Not only is a person considered a shoygeg, but he's actually exempt from a carbon. Ma'ikol meimar. Why? How do we make sense of this? Rather, what we're saying is the person actually thought that you're allowed to bow down to avodah zarah. By avodah zarah, thinking that you're allowed to bow down to avodah zarah, you still need to bring a carbon. But on Shabbos, you'd be entirely exempt. Legamri, Rashi. I'm sorry, the pater. Give me 1 second. Masha'en came by Shabbos, the pater. By Shabbos, you'd be pater. By avodah zarah, you'd have to bring a carbon. This legamri belongs to the question. Masha'en came by Shabbos. Rashi, Elavaymer mutter. We're gonna have to stop here. I know we're stopping in the middle of on a cliff over here. But why? How does a person ever come to think of avodah zarah as permissible? That's not a good mistake to make. How does someone ever come to make such a mistake? Rashi explains. A person who converted but then was immediately seized by the Gentiles and he never had a proper orientation to Jewish law. He knows that he has to believe in God, but he doesn't realize that avodah zarah is actually a problem for Jews. And somehow this is going to be called shagag v'lo miskaven. Professor, I don't think we have time to discuss it, but admittedly, by extending the principle of shagag v'lo miskaven to avodah zarah, we're hurting or tainting a little bit of the pristine definition that we've discovered about shagag v'lo miskaven by Shabbos, because here the action is intentional, but what's removed from his mind is his awareness. So it's not what we need a workshop, and I don't want to do this now because we're out of time. is it's not exactly, this definition of Shagag Miskavin is not entirely perfectly aligning with our Shabbos definition of Shagag Miskavin. So the Gemara just will end up here. Legamri. Adkan. I'm sorry, let me read this here. Masha Enkein, B'Shabbos the Pater Legamri. Are you going to really say that a person says Omer Mutar? They think that's equating Shabbos acceptable. They're entirely off the hook. Our whole conversation here previously about the difference between Shabbos and other mitzvahs is about multiple chatases, not to be entirely off the hook. We don't think that a person should be entirely potter just because he thinks it's permissible. And we're going to stop right here. The Gemara explains that the comment that Rabbi quoted that says there is a distinction between Shabbos and other mitzvahs. The area that Shabbos is more strict is talking about Shabbos versus Avodah Zarah. On Shabbos, when you do one sin, you do multiple acts of desecrating Shabbos. You bring multiple karbanis, Avodah Zarah, you do multiple acts of Avodah Zarah, there is a single atonement. The area that other mitzvahs are more strict than Shabbos is going to be about different kinds of mitzvahs. Which other mitzvahs? We're going to discuss soon. So I'm sorry to leave us a little bit here on a cliffhanger. But to back up, today's Gemara in a nutshell. We've re-examined another kind of shogeg, another kind of not intending to desecrate Shabbos, which is so soft and so lenient that a person could be entirely exempt. The remainder of our Gemara, at least in theory, it was devoted to figuring out how far this principle will extend. Does the principle even extend when a person intended to chop permissibly and chopped not permissibly? Abaye says that's considered a shogeg and you have to bring a carbon, and Rava says that's considered amazing. Rava, to bring proof to his opinion, quoted a text which had to do with the comparing and contrasting Shabbos and other mitzvahs. And that has been the road that we were on until now, trying to figure out where exactly would Shabbos be more severe or less severe. And so far what we have explained is that Shabbos is more strict than Avodah Zarah in regards to the karbanos that are brought. What remains open to be elaborated to understand is how sometimes other mitzvahs can be more strict than Shabbos in the department of Avodah Zarah. I know today was another Gemara that was a little bit of a brain exercise. I hope you found it somewhat interesting, and I hope we're on our way to gaining further clarity. I want to thank our great scholars and sages here for helping us along with wise insights and thoughts. And before final comments, I just want to end off, as we started, mentioning Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Moshe, whose yard site is today, and I also want to mention Chayalei Basar Lev, Aleha Shalom, it was this past week. I wish everyone a wonderful Shabbos. We're not going to end the chat until everybody has their final comments, but this concludes the formal presentation of today's Gemara. Shalom Chumash. As soon as we have a final comments, we'll end the group, we'll end the shir, and everyone's invited to rejoin to study today's Chumash. Beryl, go ahead.
Rabbi, does the Talmud discuss here or elsewhere a problem that could arise from somebody who has imperfect vision, let's say, and doesn't avera due to that, or he doesn't hear properly, and etc.? Or do we automatically assume that if someone has a physical disability, not major even, forget about major, is that an area that one could use as a reason to be considered shogeg?
This is a good question. I don't want to get into it now. It's a good question.
We can leave it on the table.
You're asking where do we cross the line between limitation of a person's understanding to a limitation of a person's physical capacity to perceive or to navigate, and that's a very good question. We'll leave that on a list of worthy questions for consideration, and we're not going to put on the 362 item list. We'll put it on this one. Sorry, Rabbi Mark.
If you can't hear, you couldn't see it, obviously, or you couldn't hear it, then obviously that has to be a form of shogeg.
Or Inus.
I mean,
Or Inus. So with Hashem's help, we'll have the opportunity to discuss it.
Only here do we get a clear answer, bang, bang. We don't know what Rava would say.
At that time, there was no means to evaluate the acuity of vision or the ability to hear. So most likely they didn't distinguish between the unintentional acts and inability to perceive what one is doing. All those technical means appeared much later.
Right. Although there is discussion in the Gemara about certain. It's a good question. Really, it's a separate shir, which is how does the Talmud deal with people that have physical impairment? What are their obligations to do mitzvot aseh, positive commandments, and what is their liability, if you will, or responsibility to avoid mitzvot los aseh? It's actually a worthy subject. There's plenty of discussion. We just need to collect it and edit it to reflect the specifics of your question.
One last remark to the professor. They did discuss the person who's amputated. Even with a tooth, there was questions. So I don't think we can escape so easily.
No, I just want to say like this, without getting into the specifics of your question. The Gemara discusses various mitzvot, and when there's an impairment that might cause a. So, for example, a person that is handicapped, they can't use their legs, is actually exempt for being ole regel, for going up to the Beis Hamikdash, because the pasuk talks about using your legs. And maybe the obligation of certain parts of studying Torah. The person is visually impaired, they might be exempt from studying Torah. And that's the fascinating discussion about certain sages of the Talmud that were actually blind or visually impaired, at least in some point in their life, and their relationship to the mitzvah of Torah study. And we could get it more. Those are though about positive commandments. So we need to spend a little more time and attention is the exemption for los aseh. Let's close it with this. Let's have Dr. Hammer. Go ahead.
Just a quick comment. We say skar mitzvah, skar avera. Okay, we spend so much more time focusing on averas, and which leads also to issues of guilt and stuff like that. So I find that very disturbing in a certain way, because in child rearing, we always say, and in our behavior, we talk about accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, give people greater self-worth, self-esteem. And the idea of focusing so much on some of these details, whatever the answer is at the end, gets one to start questioning, did I do something wrong a year ago, 2 years ago, last Shabbos, and now I just did it wrong. Somebody just flipped over my chumash because it wasn't put down the right way. Oh my God, I wonder if that's really an avera, because I respect the person who did that, but he didn't tell me why he's doing that. So I just, it's a complicated thing in my mind, but it's more than what Beryl's question to a rabbi is, regardless of what the answer is, a lot of psychic power and therefore guilt at the end goes into whether you did that or that, compared to the power of the goodness of doing mitzvahs, because there's no the schar mitzvah. You did the mitzvah, you davened, you ate, okay.
Doctor, I want to translate what you just said. You know what the doctor just told us? The doctor told us that in addition to studying Gemara and Halacha, it is essential that we study Chassidus. That's what the doctor just said. Because the Gemara needs to educate us about the exact specifics of how to keep Shabbos. And observing Shabbos gets discussion. We talked about the candles of Shabbos, and we talked about the brachas and Kiddush and Havdalah. But ultimately, because Shabbos has 39 malachas, there's going to be a lot of attention devoted to how to make sure we're adhering to and avoiding these malachas. So therefore, we need to balance our intake of Nigla and Gemara with Chassidus, because what does Chassidus talk about? The beauty of Shabbos and the effect of Shabbos and what happens spiritually when a person observes Shabbos. And so I think what the doctor's really saying is, friends, we got to make sure to supplement our diet of Gemara, Chassidus, to provide us the positive, the uplifting, and the beauty and the power of when we observe Shabbos and what happens to ourselves spiritually and psychologically in the observance of Shabbos. Shalom is giving me looks. It's time for Chumash.
Bernie, don't go to the Misnagdim's minion.
All right, friends, please rejoin for some
Shabbos.
Chumash. Shabbos, everyone.
Shabbos, thank you.
Shabbos.